Hi everybody, Michael Davis here, and welcome to Bone2Pick. We are coming to you today from HIP-BoneMusic headquarters here in New City, New York, and we are so fortunate today to have one of the iconic New York trumpet players of all time as our Artist of the Month, the great Marvin Stamm. As we all know, Marvin is an internationally renowned jazz trumpet soloist. He has released over a dozen CDs as a solo artist and leader. He has appeared on dozens more as a featured soloist. He toured and recorded early on with the Stan Kenton Orchestra and recorded 5 albums with Stan Kenton. Toured for a couple years with the Woody Herman Orchestra, also with Benny Goodman. In late 1966, he moved to New York City and immediately made his mark, becoming a very busy studio session player. He's a very early member of the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra, a charter member of the great Bob Mintzer Big Band. I think it would be easier to list who he has not recorded with than who he has recorded with, but I'll give you a few of the ones that really jump out to me. He's recorded with the late great Bill Evans, Quincy Jones, Paul McCartney, Oliver Nelson, Wes Montgomery, Freddie Hubbard, Donald Fagen, Pat Williams, Paul Desmond, George Benson, and that's just to name a few. He's active worldwide as a guest artist and clinician, and very active in the jazz education world these days. And on a personal level, for me, I've been very fortunate to play with Marvin many times over the years, and in particular, some really wonderful experiences with Bob Mintzer's big band. And I know we have a lot of folks who are younger viewers, and I can remember being a youngster myself and thinking about a career in music. And back then in the 70s, I would go to the record store, and those were the LP days, and you'd look on the back of the LP and they would list all the musicians. So it was so wonderful as a brass player to look at all these players, and I would pick up the latest CTI release, or it could be any label back then, and you would see the same group of stellar players listed every time, and it would be Marvin Stamm and Alan Rubin and Randy Brecker and Lou Soloff and John Faddis and Wayne Andre and Paul Felice and Tony Studd, and I started buying records because I would see these guys on the records, and it exposed me to a lot of artists that I didn't know about and became fans of. So it really is an amazing experience for me today to sit down with Marvin. And so, Marvin, without further ado, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to come talk about your extraordinary career with us.
My pleasure to be here.
And why don't we jump in early on? I know you grew up in Memphis, and just maybe talk about your early memories and what drew you to music and the trumpet early on.
Well, when I went to school, instead of middle school, we had junior high school, which was grades 7, 8, and 9, and high school in Memphis was 10, 11, and 12. And I think it was pretty standard during those years in a lot of the cities in the Midwest and the South. I'm not sure about up north. There was a requirement when you reached the 7th grade that you had to either take instrumental music or you had to be a member of the chorus and take art. And my voice had changed from having a lovely soprano voice to becoming what you hear now, and I never had any talent to draw, and so I thought maybe I was a little shy. I thought maybe I could hide in the band. I picked the trumpet because my brother, who I'll mention in a few minutes again, my brother had a record of Clyde McCoy's Sugar Blues with the famous harmony, and that really attracted me. So I decided to play the trumpet. My band director in junior high school was a very good local Memphis trumpet player, did a lot of work around town. So he was very interested in those students who really seemed to gather some steam behind their musical endeavors, and he would take us around to music stores and things like that, maybe every 4 or 5 weeks, and play us recordings, usually symphony orchestra recordings. And that furthered my interest in the music. In the meantime, my brother, Gordon, who is 5.5 years older than me, somehow or another, probably through the radio, because in those days, in the early 50s, there were still band recordings from all the hotels around the country. They had bands for dancing, what we used to call territory bands, but also name bands like Buddy Morrow and people like that, Sam Donahue's band, the Tommy Dorsey band, groups like that would come and play at these hotels. They'd be in a town for maybe 2 weeks or 4 weeks. They would broadcast from the different places. So that's where he probably got his interest in music. He never played anything, but he started a jazz collection. And a lot of it was West Coast jazz, but a number of it was some of the early music, Basie, Ellington, groups like that. And I would hear this music going upstairs after I played, and I would be attracted to, what was going on, because I was excited now playing this instrument. And I asked my brother if I could go upstairs and play along with his records, when he wasn't using it. And he, being the kind-hearted person he was, said yes. Now, he was my first jazz influence. That's how things got started for me. But in those days, also in Memphis, there were no jazz programs. It was only concert band programs. I don't know that there were even any string programs in the junior high schools and high schools in Memphis at that time. None that I can recall. So everything was concert band. And there was a lot of good concert band music that was written, particularly for the junior high school level, and there were a lot of transcriptions from in the high school situation. And all of that music being well written was something that, encouraged a young player to play. There was a lot of melodic material, a lot of stuff that was transcribed from classical music for orchestra, such as Elsa's Procession to the Cathedral and Old War Horses like that. So that was my start. And I picked up on improvisation pretty quickly. I didn't ever even know what to call it. I did my practice, the band director had out of the Bellman book, and then the icing on the cake for me was to go to my brother and say, can I go upstairs and play with your records? And then, of course, at first it was awful, because I had no connection with my ear to the horn and the music. When people talk about playing by ear, of course, musicians know that one of the most important things to develop, besides anything else, is your ear, because that gives you the connection to everything, from intonation to sound to tone quality to blending with others to everything, So what I didn't realize in doing this was I was developing something that was quite unique to jazz musicians. And I started first copying whoever solo was on the record, trying to play along with the ensemble. And over a period of a couple of years, I started moving along to my own melodies and so on. By the time I left the ninth grade, well, let me put it this way. By the time I finished the eighth grade, having played for 2 years, I knew that this was what I wanted out of life.
That's awesome.
By the time I finished the ninth grade, I had started developed pretty good improvisation, all by ear. Had no idea about chord changes or theory or anything. And then going to high school, the high school I had, there was a terrific band director there. And he was also one of these people that was very encouraging to his students. And what a lot of students today don't understand is the fact that back when I went to school, number one, the teacher was autonomous in the classroom, had the authority. The principals and the parents backed up the teacher. And they had full support. And so a teacher could go to his classroom, to students, and say, if you're not going to practice, if you're not going to learn your parts, you have to leave the band. Because I want the band to sound good, and I want only people in here who want to play well. He wasn't trying to develop a professional. He was trying to say, if you're going to be here, you're going to practice and learn your part, and if you don't, you're out. Today, that's practically unheard of, I'm sure. So that kind of attitude and growing up under that kind of authority was very, very good for me as far as my musical development. Although they really didn't have to work too hard on me, because I just loved playing so much.
You had a passion for it early on.
But
awesome.
But this band director in high school, I finally worked it out where I had all my subjects and 2 study hall periods, the last 2 years of high school, 2 study hall periods, the last 2 periods of the day, so I could practice. And if he heard like 2 or 3 minutes of silence, he would open the door, stick his head in and say, oh, I guess you've decided to be a local Memphis trumpet player. He knew just the right thing to say. And when he would see me get frustrated about things, he would say, remember this, you need to put a pound of patience in this pocket and a pound of patience in that pocket and keep at it. I mean, he was a beautiful philosopher, and he knew how to push you forward in a positive way.
That's
it was
awesome.
good. I was very fortunate.
That's awesome. Well, I'm sure he's very proud of his prize pupil as it progressed through the years. But let's talk about the next chapter in your life. They're going to North Texas State University, and we all know of North Texas as the jazz powerhouse that it is, and great, still to this day, and one of the great music schools and jazz programs anywhere in the world. And Marvin, when you got there, I'm sure it was sort of at the beginning of jazz education movement. Some of it, I guess, exists, but maybe share some of your recollections of what the program was like back in those days.
Well, when I went to North Texas, I started there the summer semester in 57 and started full-time in the fall of 57. The jazz education movement had not even started.
Oh, okay.
Gene Hall was the director. He had begun the program in 1947, I believe, or 48. And what we had were a lot of really fine players. Texas had great high school band programs, great marching band, but also great concert band programs that were stressed. And the colleges benefited from all that. The thing was, when I went there, one of the graduating trumpet players was a fellow named Mickey Tull, which the music world knows him as Fisher Tull, the great composer.
Wow. Okay.
Was an excellent trumpet player and a very good jazz arranger. There were people, this was surprising to me because in Memphis, I was all around just local people. There were people from Pennsylvania, from New York, from California, from all over the country that were studying there. So all of a sudden I was among people, many who were much more exposed to many more things education-wise than probably I was. Fortunately, I was able to, qualify to play in the main band. But I was sitting under the auspices of the lead trumpet player, who was a veteran of the Korean War, who was an excellent player. And there were other very good jazz players there. It was a program of people that you were just really going to college, and you were playing with the good college program. And we did some festivals in Oklahoma and in Texas that were going on, but we never really traveled a lot. I'm not sure at this point what Gene Hall's thoughts were at the time about spreading out, but he had an invitation, I believe, to go to Indiana University beginning in the fall of 1959, and that's when Leon Breeden took over the program. And Leon Breeden was a completely different personality. He was a humble person, but he was also a very energized person, and somehow or another he had a vision that went farther out. And I'm not sure exactly how he did it, but we got an invitation to play at the 1960 Notre Dame Jazz Festival, which was the premier jazz festival of college groups at that time. And we won the outstanding band, and I was fortunately, for me, I was designated outstanding trumpet player and outstanding instrumentalist. In the meantime, there were also some other really fine musicians there, including Chuck Mangione and his brother Gap, who came there from Rochester with their group. And of course, theirs was a I think it was a quintet, and it was terrific, but a small group competing with a big band is pretty tough.
Right.
But that, it was very good. One of the judges was Stan, and he heard me play, and the prize for that was for the band to come to the Kenton Clinics in the summer of 1960, which I think must have been either the second year of the camps or the third year. I don't remember. I don't recall whether they started in summer 58 or 59, but we were to be Stan's band at that time. We had the same instrumentation: 5 trumpets, 5 trombones, and 5 saxes. And so we played his library, and every day we rehearsed with him, and every night we played a concert for the students at the camps. So he had a chance to hear me play all the time. And I was very fortunate that I happened to be at the right place at the right time with that. I learned a lot at the school, studied with John Haney, who was a very fine trumpet teacher. and very involved with his students, cared a great deal. Most of the faculty in the school, their whole thrust, as opposed to colleges today, which are a whole other entity, which seem to be more like money-making entities as opposed to education entities, the school really cared about producing students. And North Texas at that time was 5,000. The whole thing, including night students now, is over 40,000 people at that school. So, I mean, really dwarfs it from the time I was there. But it was a very good, from getting a very good foundation in junior high school and high school, they were a good polishing tool to set someone out in the professional world with at least preparation. And that was very important. So I had an offer from Stan to go right after the clinics, and I told him I had 1 year left of college, and I couldn't do that because my father and mother had never been to college, and this was very important to them, and I thought it was important to me too. He said, "Well, I'll keep you in mind." And just to quickly finish off this story, 2 months later, sometime about mid-October, I got a phone call from him that Sam Noto had gotten a job at the Latin Quarter in New York and was leaving the band about 3 or 3.5 weeks before that fall tour was over. Is it possible I could get a leave of absence and sub for him until the end of the tour? And at that time, I was now pretty much down to like 1 or 2 academic courses and the rest music courses. And I went to every professor, and they said, absolutely, don't miss this opportunity. So I spent 3.5 weeks with him. He said, the band's off till April. I'd like you to join the band when we come back on. I said, well, I don't graduate till May. He says, I'm hiring somebody temporarily till you get there.
That's great.
That's how it happened. And you couldn't plan that.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, and let's talk about that. Leads so perfectly into what I did want to talk about your time with Stan, and I'm sure you feel that way. I know from my experience with Buddy Rich's band, it was the greatest thing that could happen, and I feel bad now that those playing opportunities don't exist for younger players to go out on the road like that and just play hard every night. But tell us about what that was like. Obviously, he heard your talent and wanted you in the band, which is fantastic. What was that experience like? I know you spent several years with him and recorded several records.
I was with Stan for 2 years.
2 years, okay.
And it was interestingly, he only wanted one trumpet soloist in the section, which coming from North Texas, we had 3 soloists. Actually, we had 4 soloists in the trumpet section of 5, and I was a bit surprised at that, but of course it really gave me the spotlight as far as playing was concerned. Stan was a very father-like figure, and I think he saw himself that way, which for a young musician like myself of 22 coming out of college was of great benefit. I mean, I didn't feel like I was going out there and working for, if I'd have gotten on Buddy's band at 22, Buddy Rich's band, I don't know that I could have taken his personality. I'm
sure you would have been fine, but yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
I know you do, and I got to learn firsthand later on after I moved to New York. But Stan was very good that way, and this was when I joined the band full time in 61, May of 61. That's when he had started the Mellophonium band.
Okay.
Which I have to say was never my favorite band. Because I grew up, my brother, the Kenton records were some of his favorites, and he had records going back to the beginning of the band. And then there was 3 or 4 LP collection called the Kenton era, and then coming on up to contemporary concepts and all those things. Okay. So I grew up listening to Connie Condoli and Buddy Childers and Maynard and those guys and so on, and just these 4 horns and everything being so heavy, it never really allowed it to get to those. I don't think to that same level of musicality that you could get with those guys playing a book where there was more room, less weight, more room for expansion, for the soloist and for the band itself. But still excellent musicians on the band with Gabe Baltasar, and Sam Donahue was on for a while. Don Mintzer came on for a while. And that's where I first met Charlie Mariano, who became a real influence, and with whom I recorded later after I had left the band. And Keith Lamont, who was an excellent trumpet player, Dalton Smith, a number of Bob Rolfe, who had been with Harry James, some really good players. The star of the band was Bob Fitzpatrick. He was, everybody looked at Bob as a curmudgeon, but if he took but he had such a musical soul, and somehow he saw in you this feeling of respect, and that regardless of that, you really honored's not the word, had deep respect for him, he would open up to you. And I always felt very comfortable with him. And as far as musicality, I never heard anyone play with any more extreme and beautiful dynamics than this man as a lead trombone player. And if you're standing back in the trumpet section, and Stan would start that ballad with the trombone choir, and you could barely hear them, and then all of a sudden this sound just kind of came out of nowhere. It was absolutely thrilling.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's very cool.
Great.
It's interesting too, a lot of us kind of forget that Stan, he was really instrumental in the jazz education. I went to the camps when I was right before my senior year in high school, and also the way that his own label, Creative World, and kind of a precursor to what was to come in terms of artist self-publishing, so to speak, but putting out their own products, and he published the music. He was really a pioneer in that whole jazz education and jazz movement. There
was something going. There was a germ going on there, and I think they brought him in right at the beginning, and he became the impetus for that. And people like Leon Breeden and Tasso Harris, the great trombone player from Denver, who eventually became president of, at that time, NAJE, and getting Matt Betton in as the executive director. And a number of other people. It was Stan's magnetism that started to pull that together and brought it along and kept it going for a long time. And Stan was very, very he was very, very enthusiastic about education. He thought that's where the future of the music was going to be for the listener.
He was certainly correct about that.
Yeah.
Let's stay in the road touring bands for a minute and talk about your time with Woody Herman. I know you spent a couple of years with Woody as well, right?
I spent a year with Woody.
A year, okay.
After I left Stan and spent 8 or 9 months doing freelance work between Dallas and Memphis and so on, I went out to Reno. One of my closest friends, who was an excellent drummer and a college roommate, had moved out there and called and said, there's a lot of good work out here. And I went out and worked for almost 2 years in Reno.
Okay.
Reno was much smaller in those days than it is now. But a lot of good work, a really wonderful group of great musicians doing all the shows. Basically, they were a small Las Vegas. I was out there for, as I said, probably a year and 10 months, and I got a phone call from Bill Chase. And I had never met Bill. And, of course, I knew who he was because I knew about the Thundering Herd albums. I had 3 or 4 of them before he called. And he invited me to join the band, and I was quite taken by it. Of course, it was time for me to move on. You sitting and playing shows, in a casino goes only so far, and it was wonderful to have an opportunity to get out. The band was excellent. The trumpets were terrific. There was besides Bill, who played lead, there was a fellow named Alex Rodriguez from L.A., who was a terrific player, Woody hated him, but he was a terrific player. Paul Fontaine and I split the jazz, and Paul, who I don't know whether you know him from Boston.
I don't know.
But he was part of the original herd, along with Billy Hunt, who was from Oklahoma, were the two jazz trumpet players on the beginning of the Thundering Herd thing when Bill Chase joined the band. And Bill, oh goodness, how could I not remember, who became the manager of the band?
Bill Byrne.
Bill Byrne was the fifth trumpet player. And interestingly, for any young trumpet players, Bill Byrne played all the fifth trumpet parts. He had this most beautiful, full, round, classical sound that just fit any style that of any tune that Woody would call. But he laid such a foundation for anybody who were on the upper parts, to play on. And it was a thrill to hear him play a part, just to listen to that sound every night.
Yeah.
So the trumpet section was excellent. There was a very good saxophone section. At the time, most of the time that we toured, it was Sal Nistico was in the tenor section.
Sal was on it
Frank Vicari was playing lead. Sal Anastas was playing baritone saxophone. And the other tenor player was Bob from Detroit, who also I met at the 1960. I'll think of his name in a few minutes.
Oh wow, that's
very
crazy.
good. There was a period when Carl Fontana was on the band when we went to the 3-month State Department tour of 7 African countries and 2 Iron Curtain countries.
Oh wow,
and
that must have been awesome.
That was unbelievable.
Of course.
So it was there, and Woody was. Totally different kind of leader than Stan. The band was a total different style of band, of course. Instead of being heavy, it was much more in the straight ahead swinging stuff, as Woody always was. And Nat Pierce was playing, Ronnie Zito on drums, and various bass players. But for at least 6 or 8 months, Michael Moore played bass.
Wow.
And man. You don't get any better than that.
Yeah,
it's really nice. So Woody was an interesting study. He was always consistent with his own playing. He featured. Everybody in the band had their own features. It was really there was a lot of freedom in the band, but freedom with parameters. Mm-hmm. But Woody was one of these people that if you were on a down cycle. Like, for instance, if you came in and you had hung out before the gig and had a couple of drinks, and you came in and he could intuit where anybody was at any time. I never saw anything like this. And what he would do is, like, right away, if he knew you were not yourself, he'd call your feature number. And you could just see, like, it was like, oh no, not me, not now. and I think he used to get a big kick out of being a bit of a sadist, if you know what I mean. But he one night after I had left the band, I have 2 really marvelous after leaving the band stories about him. One night I was playing with my group at next to Eddie Condon's after they had moved uptown.
Oh, okay, the legendary Eddie Condon's.
And Woody came in, and on intermission, one of the waiters came over and said, Woody Herman came in. He's sitting over there. He wondered if you'd join him for a drink or something. So I went over and sat with him, and we talked for a while. He wanted to know about jazz education. He was interested in what was going on with that, and we talked for a good while. I gave him, what information I knew. I certainly told him he should give Stan a call and talk to him about his involvement. This was probably 1969 or something like that.
Okay.
So it had been, the movement had been established for a while. And then I went back on and played the next set, and he stayed the whole time. And I had a chance to go over and just talk with him and sit with him for the next intermission. And it was really, after not having seen him for maybe 3 years, it was something that kind of, brought us back in close contact. Mm-hmm. Then about a year or two later. Actually, it was about a year before Woody passed. I don't remember what year that was. Brian O'Flaherty, you remember
Sure,
Brian?
very,
Great
very
lead
well.
trumpet player.
Yeah, absolutely.
I knew Brian when he was a student at Northern Illinois University. And Brian, the band was on Christmas break, and for some reason, some casino in Atlantic City had called, hopefully not a Trump casino, had
Amen to that.
had called about him doing a high roller night. So he wasn't going to fly people in, from all over the country. So he asked Brian, who was working in New York at the time, to get a band together. And Brian called me to come and play on the band. And it was easy to see that Woody was not in the greatest of health at that point. And we played the first set. And Woody called a break-in, and he sat down on the piano bench as everybody walked away. And I put my horn down, and I walked by, and he grabbed my arm. He said, "Thank you." Boy, I can't tell you what that did to me.
Wow.
That,
of course, that's awesome.
For him to just pass on that feeling, and you could see that this was not an easy time for him, and you could see that this was only going one way.
There in the end, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing that, Marvin. Both those great stories. That's
it was
amazing to hear that. Let's talk about your move to New York City. Obviously, we could spend the whole interview talking about what you've done in New York City. But I'm dying to hear this. Just I know you moved in late 1966, but I was wondering if you talk about anything that you like about your years in the studios and on the jazz scene in New York. But the work situation, I got the tail end of a little bit by the time I got here, but it was so inspiring and electric and just energizing to be in that, a little bit of that. You were a kingpin of that world. Can you give us a sense of what the studio scene was like when you were in your busy years? And also, I always found it interesting that you, along with Randy Brecker, Alan, Lou, kind of bridged that generational gap from, say, not a gap, but like the Irby Green generation, then your guys' generation, and that was, your generation seemed to me to be right in the middle of when it was at its the premium level of work and the quality of work and all of those things, the record business being what it was at that time. Anyway, I'll stop talking. Talk about it.
Interestingly enough, the reason I came to New York was once again because of all the recordings that that I had heard, some from my brother, others when we were in North Texas. There were guys who there was one guy who came from St. Louis, an excellent trumpet player. He's still alive. He's living in Champaign-Urbana, named Tom Wordle, excellent jazz player. And Tom came from a family in St. Louis when he drove down to North Texas, and his father, I think, was in the oil business. He must have worked for one of the big companies. So Tom came from a family with means, and Tom was able to, during his years, purchase a lot of records. And he was pretty musically advanced. I mean, he's the first one that I ever heard the name Alban Berg. And I remember sitting down listening to it saying, "What is this?" But anyway, so my exposure was to a lot of the music. I mean, Tom was the first one who played me Miles Ahead. And then, of course, then I went and I bought all the other Miles records, besides a small group, but particularly the Gil Evans stuff. And I was never really, Los Angeles never seemed to me a place that I wanted to live.
Okay.
It was just a different kind of environment. New York was totally different for me too, but except that the musical environment that I heard, the players that attracted me most were all of these guys like Bernie Glow, Ernie Royal, Snooky coming from the Basie band, Joe Wilder, Thad, who was in New York, all these guys who, Joe Newman. It was the environment, and I was a Jerry Mulligan concert jazz band fan, so there were those guys that were in that band. It just seemed that everybody that I really loved lived in New York. So my decision to come to New York was based on that. And when I came to New York, first of all, there was a really busy recording scene. And there was a scene of those guys who were doing a lot of the jazz recording, who also were members of the staff orchestras at ABC, CBS, NBC. There was also another group of recording guys that were almost a different branch, and they you know, I mean, I don't even know quite how to place them. They didn't do that work, but they did a lot of other recording work, a lot of the ethnic work, you know, there was an Italian clique of musicians who did a lot of things together. Then there was the whole club date business. There were guys who were doing, you know, 8, 9, 10 club dates a week, and they were making over 100. Back then, they were probably making 85, 90,000, which a few years later, while it hit its peak, were probably making $125,000, $130,000 a year playing society gigs. And this was before cover bands for rock and roll.
Right.
It was an amazing time. And then all the Broadway shows, the orchestras, I don't know what the minimums were, but there were 25 to 40 pieces in the pit. What was West Side Story? 41 pieces or something like that with strings? Mm-hmm. I mean, the music business was really flourishing. And as I came to town, I mean, I'll tell you my particular thing in a minute, but I actually bridged the Bernie Glow, Ernie Royal, Snooky Young, Irby Green, Buddy Morrow, whose band I had played with for 3 months one summer between school, and guys like that, Wayne Andre, Tony Studd, of course Paul Felice, and Dick Hickson, guys like that, Charlie Small, all those guys. I bridged them and the Alan Rubens, Faddises, and so on. I was started in the business more quickly than they did with those guys. And they were all about 5 years younger than me, but even though they were here, they didn't get that involved in that business right away. It's funny, the day I arrived in New York, I flew in, I stayed at a hotel called the Consulate Hotel. When we were traveling with the bands, we used to stay in that hotel. It used to be called the Forest. It was on 49th Street between 8th Avenue and Broadway. So you were 4 blocks from the Spotlight Bar, which was one of the hangouts of the studio guys, and about 3 blocks from Jim and Andy's, 4 blocks from Giardinelli's. Manny's was right down the street from Jim and Andy's. I mean, everything was centered right there. And I think I came in and I was paying $200 a month for a really nice size hotel room. And a woman, the maid who worked there was a Scandinavian woman who took a shine to me as a young kid. She must have been in her late 40s. And she was just kind of adopted me as a, you know, an outside of her home son. Made sure I had towels. Never fixed my room up until afternoon, and so on and so. I mean, it was wonderful. Awesome. The day I came in, I flew in, checked in the hotel. I'd never been to Jim and Andy's, even on the years on the road with Buddy, with Stan, with Woody. I went over to Jim and Andy's, and the place was empty, except for the bartender and this very handsome, tall, light-skinned black man. And they were talking, and I walked in, I sat down I think there must have been a stool between me and the gentleman who was on the same side of the bar as I was. And the bartender, who I later found out was Jim, who owned the place, says, "What can I get you?" I said, "Well, could I have a cup of coffee, please?" He served me a cup of coffee, and he went back to talking to this gentleman, and then he went up in the back to do something, and the fellow sitting there leaned over. He says, "Are you new in town?" And I said, "Yes, I just arrived today." He says, "Really?" He says, "Are you a musician?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "What do you play?" I said, "I'm a trumpet player." He says, "Really?" He says, "Me too. My name is Ernie Royal."
That is unbelievable.
One of the most, one of my heroes, and also one of the 2 busiest lead trumpet players in New York City, along with Bernie Glow. So he had worked in the morning. He had an evening recording, and he had the afternoon off, and he was just sitting chewing the fat with Jim at that point in time. And we talked for well over 2 hours.
Wow.
And he gave me a lot of the scoop of what to do to join an answering service, radio registry,
Yes.
to make sure that I'm always available to them, that if they have the number where I'm staying, in this case the hotel, if I went somewhere to a friend's house, or I was going to, as I said, Jake Coben's practice studio down the street, to let them know the number there. There were no cell phones or beepers or anything like that in those days, but I always let them know where I was. And when I left, he said, you know, I had a call from CBS for a TV show, and I can't do it. I'm going to give the contract to your name. And I said, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Of course, the guy didn't call me, because usually they had to hear your name a number of times before
Sure.
they would open up to you. But it was really remarkable. And Ernie and I became very dear friends. But anyway, a week from the day after I arrived, I had somehow, under some circumstances, met this young lady. And we got, I guess, talking, conversation, whatever. She said, why don't you come up to my place tonight, and I'll cook dinner. I said, okay, that sounds great. You know, I didn't have anything to do. I said, but later on, I'm probably going to go to the Village Vanguard to hear Dad and Mel's band. She says, fine, but come over for dinner and we'll just visit for a while. So I get to her place. She's getting ready to serve dinner, and the phone rings, and she says, Marvin, it's for you. Because I had given the answering service my number. Jimmy Nottingham is sick. Can you cover for him at the Village Vanguard tonight? Sure. Now, I had never met any of the guys there. I had met Jimmy, I think, when Woody's band did the Ed Sullivan show, when I was on the road with them, but he wouldn't have remembered me for that, and he didn't have him call me. The service knew that I had just arrived in town and probably would be available, so they called me to go down, and I was basically playing Jimmy's book, which was the split lead book. And of course, that was the classic band that started. It was, since it was toward the end of November, or probably the first week of December of that year, the band actually started in February of that year of 1966. Right. So I played that night with the band, and after we finished, Mel said, can you come into the kitchen? Sure. Went in there, and he and Thad said, look, we'd like you to be the swing man for the trumpet section. And of course, having worked out in Vegas, out in Reno, I knew what the swing man was, which was anybody who wanted to take off had call me first before calling anyone else to sub for him. And I was in from that point on until I think Bill Berry left for California with the Merv Griffin show. I was usually in almost every Monday night subbing for one of the four chairs in the band. Now, the reason that was so significant is being that it was the first year of the band, and of course a lot of the jazz scene was hot. The Half Note was going great downtown. There were all kinds, the Blue Note was down there, all kinds of jazz clubs around. Quincy might come in, or Oliver Nelson might come in, Pat Williams, Jack Courtner, Sonny Rollins, Stan Getz, you name whoever, writers, players would come in, and then of course on the intermission they were all in the back telling road stories with Thad. And the only guy they didn't know was me. Who's that? And that's how my reputation got established in town. Wow. And also, I must say, the trumpet players were very kind to me in letting people know. And there was one other factor. Johnny Richards, when he heard I was in town, and this was fairly quickly after I had been here, called me to record an album called Se Habla Español. And one of the trumpet players in the band was Bert Collins. Mm. And Bert and I became friends, and Bert also spread my name around a lot. Mm. So the point of the story is that really none of this can be planned. Mm-hmm. You know, whether you want to call it luck or fate, it doesn't make any difference. Destiny, but if you don't happen to be in the right place at the right time, the opportunities don't present themselves. Of course, you have to be prepared.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't get the opportunity, what difference does it make how prepared you are? Once you have that, then you have to do something else that's very important. And that is, you have to respect those who've been there and done that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the guys liked about me. If I went on a gig, unless I was told something else, I always sat in the lowest trumpet chair. I didn't play solos unless somebody passed a part to me. I always respected the other guys. And because of that, almost every gig that I ever did, if there was something to play, they would make sure that I'd get an opportunity to play. So the producer or the arranger or the audience or the band leader could have a chance to hear me play. Mm. And that's the kind of community that was going on there.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one other quick story, and then I'll let you go.
No.
So
that's why we're here.
I mentioned Charlie Mariano. In 1963, the end of the summer, he asked me to come to New York to play on an album of his. He was doing a new album. There were 3 segments. There was a string segment with him and rhythm section and string quartet. There was a brass section, and there was a quintet thing. The quintet was with Charlie and me, Jackie Byard, Tootie Heath, and Richard Davis. The brass section, and we did 3 tunes with that. The brass section, there were 3 tunes. Don Sebesky had arranged everything for the string section and the brass section. And in the trumpet section was, at that time, Jimmy Nottingham, who did not know me, Bernie Glow, and Jimmy Sedler. We recorded the 3 tunes, and at the end of the session, Bernie Glow comes over to me and says, "Oh, this is the other thing." I mean, some of this is so stark in my memory. If you know how you could have 4 or 5 people in a room, and if there's somebody that you don't know, typically you talk to the person you do know. They didn't do that. They didn't know me at all. Yet when conversation went on between takes, they included me, looking at me in the whole thing, as if I was part of the whole. As if they had known me. At the end of the session, Bernie Glow comes over to me and says, "I'm sorry there were only 3 tunes. Otherwise, you would have gotten the 4th lead part." I looked at him and said, "No, I wouldn't." So 6 months after being in New York, Bernie Glow comes walking down the street. I say, "Excuse me, Bernie." He looks up, he says, "Marvin, when did you get to town?" Now, this is, 3.5 years later. And I mentioned, he says, "Well, why didn't you call me?" I said, "Bernie, I didn't know you'd even remember me." "Of course." And then we became dearest of friends. I was in his home, he was in my home. But these kinds of things, when they happen to you, and particularly when you're a young, impressionable person who's not part of that kind of environment, who's accepted into that environment, it's the most thrilling thing in the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, for someone whose passion is something like playing music, and all of a sudden you're at the top of the world. And I want to tell you, when you talk about my place in this world, to this day, I still feel like I'm trying to play up to the level that those guys did. Mm. And they were just such magnificent musicians and magnificent people. And Bernie said something to me one day. I said, after I'd been in town about 1.5 years, I said, "Bernie, the trumpet players, all you guys are so generous with me. How do you repay that?" He says, "When a new guy comes to town and he's a good guy, you help him."
Mm. Wow. Those are great stories and great advice, too. Thanks for sharing that, Marvin. Let me just ask you about a couple specific projects that I want to ask you. Many of you may know this, but there's a legendary flugelhorn solo on Paul McCartney's Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey tune, which was probably his biggest hit after post-Beatles as a solo artist. And, of course, it was played by Marvin, so maybe you could talk a little bit about what that experience was like, and it lives on to this day. Everybody knows that solo.
but nobody knows who played it. And well, I can tell you something. I mean, you know, when the way it happened was, there were 3 tunes on that album that featured brass. There were 4 trumpets, 3 or 4 French horns, 4 trombones, tuba. I think that was it on those, playing to the tracks that he had done with the rhythm section, Denny Sowell and Dave Spinoza and Huey McCracken and the guys. He had already done the tracks. And after we finished playing the backgrounds on Uncle Albert, he came over to the trumpet section, which was Mel Davis, Ray Crisara, and Snooky Young, and myself. And he said, I have a little horn solo for someone to play. Who'd like to do it? And Mel Davis said, let the kid do it. So I played it, and he squatted down, and he says, this is what I want it to sound like. I want it to kind of sound like it's coming through a radio cone. And I said, well, you know, sing it to me. And he goes, I said, okay. So I knew what he wanted, and I told him, I said, I think probably this would be more to your liking if I put it on the flugelhorn than the trumpet, because it's a softer, and I can get back and play a more subtle sound. He said, okay, let's try that. He goes back in there, and I must have done, you know, 6 or 7 takes until he said, okay, that's the way I want it to go. And then we recorded those, and that became the thing on the piece. Now, of course, in those days, the only people who were listed on the album were the rhythm section guys. So for a year or more, I was the most famous unknown trumpet player in the world. And I would go, I remember being in California when I met my wife, and we would go to the big, what was it, Albertsons, the big supermarket there. Sure. And I walk in, and that would be playing on there, and I'd look around like, anybody know who that is? Funnily enough, about a month and a half ago, my next door neighbor, the wife, calls me on the phone at about 10 o'clock in the morning. She says, I just went out running some errands. I'm coming back, and I'm listening to Sirius XM. And she says, they played Uncle Albert. And then Paul McCartney got on and said, you know, started talking a little bit about it, and said, and that was my old buddy Marvin Stamm on flugelhorn playing the horn part. Floored me. Wow, how would he? I haven't seen him since the day we did that, which was what, 1970 something. Never spoken to him. Never had no reference on the record jacket. How would he know to say that?
That's awesome. Well, we're doing what we can here to make sure everybody knows you played that flugelhorn solo. It's great. Well, one that you did get listed on, and I mentioned it in the intro, but sadly we lost one of a great American composer, Pat Williams, this year, and a arranger, conductor, and a legendary gentleman. I had the good fortune of working for him once, and I know you did many times. And he's well known as a TV composer, wrote the theme to the Mary Tyler Moore Show and the Bob Newhart Show. And in doing a little research for this, one of my favorite projects that he ever did was a record called Threshold. And I didn't realize it. And for those of us, all of us who do our own projects, it's good to know that even somebody like Pat Williams, I understand he actually financed that himself and did exactly the way he wanted, but even back then in the early 70s. But anyway, this is an amazing project that Pat did all the arrangements and some compositions for. And there were 2 main featured soloists, Tom Scott, the great woodwind saxophone soloist from Los Angeles, and Marvin Stamm. And I remember picking up that LP, and I'm sure I wore it out because it was fantastic. And maybe you could just share some of the feelings and memories you have about that particular project.
Yeah, I had done Pat when I first started working for Pat. He had been an arranger for a good while, working in New York, and he had done a lot of work for Edie Gourmet and Steve Lawrence. And he had pretty well known, so he was very successful in New York. This is before he moved to LA, and he wanted to do some projects of his own, and Verve signed him on as an artist, and we did, I think it was 3 brass albums, just brass section, with a rhythm section. Bill Livornia on drums. I don't remember who the bassist was. It might have been Chuck Rainey or Jerry Jamont. And I don't even remember the keyboard. Keyboard player might have been Dick Hyman. It was some pretty sensational brass stuff. Ray Cressara, Johnny Frost, myself, and I believe Mel Davis was the other trumpet player. And I did a number of little solo things on that for Pat. But Pat knew me as a jazz player because he had bought the only album I did with Woody. And that's the reason he first started hiring me to play. He and Jack Courtner had listened to the album that Woody did called Woody Herman Sings Al Jolson. And the arrangements were all done by Ralph Burns, Bill Holman, were the two main arrangers.
Great arrangements, to say the least.
And for some reason or another, they wrote a bunch of trumpet solos in that album. That was the only thing I ever recorded with Woody. And that was the reason that Pat started calling me, because he heard that, and he named me the Torch. He says, "Get me the torch." So when this album Threshold came up, he recorded everything out in L.A. and except for the title tune, which he had not done yet when I first started working on it. But Buddy Childers did all the trumpet parts, multitracked all the trumpet parts. Tom did all the saxophone parts. Billy Byers did all of the tenor trombone parts, and then Kenny Schroyer played bass trombone, and then the rhythm section guys. Larry Bunker played percussion. I think it was John Guerin played drums, and the rest of the rhythm section I'm not remembering right now. But Pat called me up and said, I'm coming to New York. I've recorded these tracks, and I want you to play solos on them. So he and Phil Ramone and me and Jack Courtner, because Jack and Pat were very tight friends, and Jack just came up to listen. We got into A&R Studios, 799 in the big room, all wood. This is where they recorded the 90-piece orchestras and 100-piece orchestras. Turn the lights down low, put the tracks on, and put the parts up on the stand, and I just played for probably 2.5 or 3 hours.
Wow.
You know, we did different takes on different things. Of course, being Phil Ramone, I asked him, I said, what takes, after they finish it, what takes did you use? He says, "Oh, we always use the first ones." I said, "Well, we could have been drinking the rest of the time." He says, "Yeah, but I know your ego, you wanted to." So and then the last tune, the title tune, we did the following summer, and I think it was probably because Pat was busy, but we did it exactly the same way, except Buddy and Buddy played 1 and 3, and I played 2 and 4 on that, and then I put the solo track on. And except for that beautiful high flugelhorn solo that Buddy played on, I think it was The Witch, I did all the trumpet solo stuff. I have to tell you that of all of the things I've ever done as a jazz soloist, that is certainly one of my favorite things. The time, the setting, whatever, the allowance to play that. The music was written, and I have to tell you, I did a couple of 3 big band albums with Pat afterwards, and he's done in the past 5-6 years, done 3 or 4 big band albums out in L.A. I don't think anything has ever come to that level of creativity as a jazz piece. But Pat was brilliant. He was just a brilliant musician. Yeah. And it was a thrill being a part of that. Yeah. What you're playing was exemplary, and it's great that he did that, because he was obviously so successful in the TV world and whatever. But to do a creative jazz project like that, so amazing. I have quickly. Speaking of Pat, I did the Mary Tyler Moore theme and the Bob Newhart theme for him, which were, you very seldom heard anything like a flugelhorn solo in the opening of a TV show, and they used it for years. And then after a number of years, they stopped paying me royalties and got someone else to play. So probably, one of the hot guys out there. Chuck maybe, or Chuck Finley, or one of the guys. But Pat was a good one, and he was a nice man, and we had some good times together. I even shared an earthquake at his house.
Okay, there you go.
With Jack Elliott. Jack and him and I don't remember who cooked, but I remember who drank. It was
nothing, having grown up in California, nothing bonds you quite like an earthquake, you know. Let's talk a little bit, and you touched on Thad and Mel, but one of my musical heroes for my entire life is the great Bob Mintzer, and I know you were part of Bob's band from the very beginning, and I remember being on Buddy Rich's band at the time. We would come in to New York for little breaks, and we always just would run and check out the Village Voice and see if Bob Mintzer's band was playing. And we got lucky. A lot of times you guys were playing at 7th Avenue South,
right.
and we'd go down, and it was Will Lee and Erskine and Keith O'Quinn and Lou Soloff and Mike Brecker and Sanborn was playing lead out. It was an unbelievable electricity of that band. Talk to us a little bit about, I know, and you can touch also on more about that if you like. To me, those two bands are just like this amazing electric thing that happened because of these dynamic leaders and writers that created, and of course the players. So what was that time like for you?
Well, I'll talk about Bob's band first. Bob's writing was so unique for that time. Mm-hmm. I mean, the things that he was writing were just so unique, and of course he was a marvelous orchestrator, so it was fun to play. It felt good. The horn felt good on your mouth playing his music. And the band was really very special. I mean, Bob and Bob Malik playing the tenors, mm-hmm. and Sanborn, of course, playing, and Bob Malik came on after Michael Brecker started, touring mostly with the small group and so on. And Roger Rosenberg, mm-hmm. those guys were just, and Pete Yellen.
Right.
On lead alto.
Yeah.
Actually, he was the lead alto player. And very unique jazz player.
Yeah.
You could just sit all night and listen to those guys play. And of course, the trumpet section, actually, when I went on the band, maybe I wasn't on the original band, but the original band started with Lou and Joe Shepley and myself and Randy, and I was playing lead. And then, for some reason, Bob might be able to tell, he wanted to replace Joe and Lou. I think he felt maybe they weren't, for whatever the reason was, and I don't know what it was, but I suggested Bob Milliken and Laurie Frink, mm-hmm. and we were the trumpet section for most all of those years that I played with the band, and it was extraordinary. I played half the lead, and the other half was split up between Laurie and Bob, and Randy played the bulk of the jazz, although I played an occasional solo. And oh boy, Keith O'Quinn! Wow, what a beautiful lead trombone player.
One of the greats.
And Dave Taylor and those guys. And
sure.
I mean, it was an excellent band, and the music was so adventurous, particularly in the beginning, because I think in the beginning, Bob was not interested or hadn't. He never discussed it with me, but I didn't feel that he was doing it so it could be published. I think later on, after the first 3 or 4 albums, I think that there was something, because Kendor started publishing all his music, which it needed to be published and made available because there were so many really good collegiate bands that could play. But before that time, I think it was all straight from his creative soul. Mm-hmm. And if you ask any of the people who played with the band, they would probably say that the first 4, particularly the first and the second one, Camouflage, and the one before that, Incredible Journey, mm-hmm. and then there was one before that was made for a Japanese label and came out on vinyl.
Band. Yeah, I still have the vinyl of that.
And that was
awesome.
the one that I think Lou and Joe were on with me. Okay. But Incredible Journey is still one of the finest big band jazz albums I can remember, and no doubt. Especially so for Randy's playing and Bob's playing. I've never heard, I even had 2 albums that Bob played tenor on on for me, and one of them, most of the tunes were his. I've never heard Bob play a mediocre solo.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody has a low point at some time. I've never heard Bob have a low point.
Yeah, I know.
He's just an amazing, I guess incredible journey would be the right. So that band was really excellent. And the unfortunate thing was we never really had a chance to tour a lot with the band. Maybe it just wasn't the right time. I think he's doing much more touring now. I think he takes the band over to Japan, and then he brings it into Manchester's Craftsman's Guild and Pittsburgh and so on. I haven't kept up with a lot of it, but Bob is a musician that stands at the top of the list of my respect. You know, Thad and Mel's band was, I can't tell you beside the fact that the band made me in New York. You know, I mean, that was a springboard for my career. All of those great players. I mean, standing there hearing Snooky play a phrase was like seeing a gem polished into a diamond. I mean, just amazing. And of course, Thad's writing was phenomenal. When I first came into the band, I think there were only 13 or 14 charts, and several of them were in pencil.
Wow.
And, you know, Brooke Meyer was in the band, Garnet Brown, Tom McIntosh, and Cliff Heather, of course, on bass trombone. Just beautiful, you know, and all those guys, great solos. Richard Williams, Bill Berry, Nottingham, and Snooky with the original trumpet section. All amazing players. And of course that saxophone section with Jerome and Jerry Dodgen and Joe Farrell, Eddie Daniels, and Pepper.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Wow.
And then when those guys aren't playing and their horns are sitting in their laps, you're listening to Roland Hanna and Richard Davis and Mel. And then after all the guys solo, Dad picks up his horn and wipes everybody out. A lesson in humility. But he always gave everybody in the band a chance to play and stretch out. I mean, really stretch out. That, to me, was the perfect extension of taking what happened with Strayhorn and Ellington and being the extension to that.
Sure, yeah.
You know. And Mel, ask any great drummer, you know, John Riley, Peter Erskine, Ed Sof, you name them, and then I'll say Mel made more music, played more music with the drums than anybody that they can think of from a total musical standpoint. Always swung, knew right where the band was, basically arranged the drum part into every section, playing this or that or combination of sections. He just knew how to enhance everything with the sound of his drums and his cymbals. It's amazing. And after I left the band, I'd been with the band for about 6.5 years. And I left the band because they wanted to start to travel more. And I was pretty well ensconced in the studio. I was well ensconced in the studio scene and just got married.
Okay.
And Mel, like most band leaders, when you leave the band, he got mad at you. But that's typical. But you know, he was not happy that I did that. And it wasn't until later on, probably sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, that John Lewis formed the American Jazz Orchestra.
Right.
And asked me if I would play lead in the band and you know, what about a section? And we talked about, you know, Virgil Jones and John Eckert and Milligan and myself in the band. And Kenny Washington started off playing drums in the band. And I think he played for 2 seasons. I think the band only lasted maybe 5 seasons or 4 seasons. They never could really get it off the ground. Lincoln Center was going at that time. We weren't in a place that could sponsor more than 4 or 5 concerts a year. But the band was really excellent, and Mel came on the band after Kenny left after a couple of years, and he and I reconnected. I mean, when I first joined the band, Mel would come by the hotel and pick me up every night. And every night when we came back, and he would sit out in front of the hotel for an hour. This was after 3 sets of the band, and we would talk. Just talk.
That's amazing.
And you know, and there were times where you really knew he was opening up his heart. Because Mel in New York, as long as it was in the jazz idiom, was well accepted. When some of the rock stuff started coming in, Mel hated that, and he made his feelings explicitly known. So, from time to, as time went on, he was really pushed himself out of the scene. But what a man!
Yeah,
what a human being! What a musician! You know, and Thad too. I don't know anything about what happened with Thad when he cut out of New York, but I got to tell you, he was marvelous to me. And you know, just being able to listen to this man as well as play his music, just to listen to somebody who had such unbridled creativity. Where did any of this come from?
Yeah, right.
Nobody thinks like that. Nobody hears like that. And it was extraordinary.
Yeah.
Because it was so unique. So
well, he was clearly the guy who brought the hard bop language into the big band, and so major influence on everybody, Bob Mintzer, everybody who followed him. But Marvin, and thank you for all those incredible stories and insights. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about, in the late 80s, you decided to refocus and change direction a little bit with your career, get out of the studio world and focus back on being a jazz artist as a soloist. Your first CD, if I'm not mistaken, was Bop Boy in 1991. And then Mystery Man followed that up. Maybe you could talk about what led you to that decision and how that went for you. And I know you're still very active in that, and then we'll talk more about current projects, but that time in your life when you decided to make the shift.
Well, actually, at the time, there were 2 albums before the Bop Boy. One was 1969 with John Carisi.
Oh wow! Okay.
Machinations, which Verve went bankrupt about 3 months after we did that, and it wasn't my fault. And then the next album we self-produced, Jack Courtner and myself, and Chris Palmero, wonderful keyboard player. Yeah. Chris and Jack wrote all the tunes, and Jack orchestrated the backgrounds, and we organized it. We did something called Stampede. Which is probably one of my favorite of all the albums that I've recorded under my own name. What happened was in 1987, and I'll tell you the circumstance, and if whatever I ever felt for Lou, I owe him this. We were rehearsing for a concert that was being done of the music of the Sauter Finnegan Band, and it was going to be done in Town Hall. And the trumpets were myself, Lou, John Wilson, who was on the original band, who was teaching at Duquesne for many years, and Joe Ferranti. Okay. But if I'm not mistaken, well, anyway, Lou comes into the rehearsal one day with a fellow, and he says, Marvin, I'd like you to meet, this is George Gruntz from Switzerland. George would like to talk to you. George in the 70s sometimes, along with 2 other Swiss musicians, father and son, Franco Ambrosetti and his father, extremely wealthy family. They were in manufacturing. They did something like building wheels for jet planes and for race cars for Ferrari. Oh, wow. Anyway, but they were excellent musicians, and Franco Ambrosetti has been one of the well-known names in Europe for years. They started this kind of thing about a party, and they invited all these American musicians over. You know, everyone from Phil Woods, Joe Henderson, Freddie Hubbard, Woody Shaw, you name them. They've all come. Faddis did it, I know, for a year or 2. So anyway, he finally started writing for this band, and they would tour every year, a couple of weeks in the fall, a couple of weeks in the spring. And this had gone on for quite a while, and Lou had been playing with them for I don't know how many years, a number of years. And George says, Lou can't make the next tour. Would you be able to come? And I happened to be free, and I said, okay, sure, I'll come. And when we got to this place, George's philosophy was he hired all these musicians, a number from Europe, some from America, and if he wanted, the lead trumpet player would, over a period of 2 weeks, bring the whole band together. They were all jazz players, many of them not really ensemble players. That was kind of a weird philosophy, I thought, but you know, but this is new, interesting. I needed to get out and have a refresher course. So the trumpet section at the time was Manfred Schoff from Germany and Polly Mikkelborg from Denmark. Claudio Roditi made that tour. I think Art Baron was on that tour. Bargeron didn't make that tour, but Dave Taylor was on it. And I can't remember who. Oh, Ray Anderson. How can I forget him?
Yeah.
Joe Henderson, Lee Konitz, Bob Malik, Luton Petrovsky, totally outside player from East Berlin, and I don't remember the baritone player's name, but Mike. Gosh, come on! From teaching down at NYU now, marvelous bassist.
Mike Richmond.
Mike Richmond, Nussbaum, and George with the rhythm section.
Wow. That's an eclectic mix for sure.
The music was out there. Larry Schneider was the other.
Oh wow, Larry Schneider.
Yeah.
Great tenor player.
And
Bill Evans. And
it was a band that a lead trumpet player, somebody's going to put some discipline on this. Are you kidding? I mean, these guys, they wanted none of that. Anyway, the experience was, this was the first time that I had played with a band like this. And over a period of time, it started to come together. But it was so out as far as some of the playing that was going on that at first it was like being slapped upside the head. But when the tour ended, it was such a revelation in creativity. All of these people were so creative that it was like, wow. George asked me to come back in the spring, and it began basically, with the exception of I think a 3-year hiatus, maybe 23 years of playing with the band. And what it did was it made me realize that I wanted to get out and play again. I had been going out and playing, you know, here and there. I subbed with different people and played with Mintzer's band and all this kind of stuff. But as far as getting out and really putting myself out there, I had been hesitant to do that for whatever the reason. So that's what made me want to do this. And around 1990, when I saw the heavy influx of the synthesizer thing coming in, and established writers doing less and less, and people coming in who were not very well educated in orchestration, being the people who were making the music, producers had, you know, the old producers who grew up in the business were gone, and everybody was a rock and roll guy. And it was also going through that period in New York when there was a lot of drugs. And I just wasn't into that. You know, I was married, I had a home life, I wanted to play. It was time for me to start thinking of a new direction. And so by the 1990, I had decided to do this. And I remember teaching at a summer jazz camp in Missouri, and Ed Sofa and I were standing there after an evening and getting ready to head off to our different rooms. And I said, you know, I'm scared. He says, why? I said, because I don't know how to make this work. And he laughed. He says, don't worry about it. It'll work. And he walked away. And it did. You know, once again, I was very lucky. I used my involvement in jazz education to help start a lot of this. And there were other people that would call with different projects and things like that. But the sad thing was as this was happening, starting to happen in the studios, you could see that the business was going to start shrinking like this, which was very sad for my colleagues.
Sure.
And then you also saw that opportunities for players playing in clubs. The clubs, some started closing in New York over a period of time, except for the mainstays. But Sweet Basil's was closing, Visione's was eventually going out. Different things. You could just see opportunities starting. So it was time to really think about getting out and doing something else and building something for the next phase. But as I've told our mutual friend Tony Cadlick, the saddest thing for me at the period of time throughout the 2000s was seeing that people as talented as Tony, yourself included, guys like that in New York City, never had the chance to have the benefit of the full potpourri of work that was happening when I came to New York, because it was something that was just, it was such a phenomenal time, and the feelings of companionship, camaraderie among the musicians was so great. The feeling of respect was so terrific. And as we all know, as work dries up and things, start to become stressful, it becomes, unfortunately, I've got to get my own, and I can't worry about a lot of other people. And that's not the way to build community. That's a time when you need to worry about other people, because you stand together. Anyway, that's another story. but that's why I made this change. And fortunately, my wife and my girls were young, but they were teenagers in early teens. They never complained about my traveling. They knew this was what I wanted to do. I had been there all during the early years and everything. And at the busiest, and certainly it wasn't all combined together, at the busiest I may have been on the road 5 months a year. But it was broken up by being out 2 weeks, home for 10 days, out for a week, home for 2.5, 3 weeks, out for a month, something like that throughout the year. But I always had their support. And that's been something that's been steady through the years, and that helps. Yeah, that helps a lot.
Well, it's great that you took the initiative to make that shift, and I know I can speak for our mutual friend Tony Cadlick, in that for us, especially getting a chance to play with yourself and the Wayne Andres of the world and the Paul Felices of the world and Lou and Randy, of course, but we do appreciate those opportunities, and I understand completely it wasn't like it was for you guys, but it's certainly appreciated on so many levels. Let me just, as we wind down a little bit, wanted to talk about seemingly kind of one of your favorite rhythm sections to work with, but I noticed from your recording, some of which I have, Ed Soph, Rufus Reid, and Bill Mays seems to be a favorite grouping of yours. Maybe just talk about those guys a little bit and some of your favorite memories of the projects you guys have done together.
Well, I've known Rufus for, must be 35 years now. Ed, I've known, I knew of him after I left North Texas. He was about 3 or 4 years behind me, but we didn't actually get close until about 25 years ago. And Bill and I have worked together since about 1995. Here's my feeling about being a musician working with a quartet, and I prefer a quartet than any other because I feel like that's the perfect intimate setting where you can really intertwine with each other. For instance, I feel when I play a solo, it's not me playing the solo, it's the four of us playing my solo, because those guys are so sensitive to what's going on and always listening and working to be a part of something special. And that's the way I feel about each one of them. Not only are they fantastic soloists, but they are such beautiful team players that they continually, there's never a moment that they let down their being involved with what I'm doing or with what each other is doing at the time. And I always say it's just as much fun for me having the horn away from my face than having the horn up to my mouth, because I'm standing in the middle of this, and each one plays with such a, for instance, Ed's sound on the drums is so beautiful. His touch, the way he tunes his drums, the cymbals and all, you know, it's different from Mel, but it's on the same principle. And Rufus, you know, this guy, when you hear him just floating through things, it makes me think of Scotty LaFaro. You know?
Right.
There's always a feeling of movement and floating, but even when he's, you still feel that there's it's just free floating, even though it may be strong and rhythmic. And Bill Mays is, you know, he's so beautifully classically trained, but he's so deep into jazz. When he puts all those tunes together, it's just extraordinary. And so we played together a lot for many years. We haven't in the last few years, really mainly because of work has slowed down. Rufus has gotten tremendously involved in his own composition. He is now being sought after for commissions, and he's also presenting at a number of places. I just received something in the on email the other day about he's presenting a concert of his works in honor of the sculptress that he wrote music for a number of her works a few years ago at Iowa City, which is coming up, I think, later this month. Bill has made his home in the wintertime for 6 months in Florida. So you know, those kinds of shifts and things are different. Of course, Ed's in Texas, so it's not easy to do. So I've been working with the new quartet quite a bit, and I can say the same thing for all of them. Mike Holliber is an extraordinary pianist, a great composer,
yes, indeed,
great orchestrator,
indeed. Yeah,
and Mike McGurk, who is a product of North Texas, is like. There's a few bass players when they play, the clarity is so there when they play, it's almost like listening to a guitarist. Mm-hmm. Tom Warrington out in California,
yeah, right.
Well, you know, that's Mike McGurk has that same clarity when he plays, and he plays it like a guitarist almost. I mean, it's not like if you play a figure, you know, it's not like he's struggling for it. It's there under his hands, and yet he can walk. He's always, same as Rufus, always listening, always attentive to everything. And then one of my favorite drummers also of all times, Dennis McCrell.
Oh, yeah. He's been a guest on our show, and he's one of the great musicians beyond the drums. He's such a great arranger, and I mean, but he's the most musical drummer you're going to find anywhere. Yeah.
To me, he's the guy that Ellington, Strayhorn, Thad, Dennis.
Yeah.
There's a lineage there.
Yeah, for sure.
And when you hear his music, it's marvelous.
Yes,
and
indeed.
I've been doing a lot of. I have done some significant recording with Mike over the past 2 years, and here is someone who's when you hear his music, this is a composer.
Oh yeah.
This is a real composer, and you can hear some of the pieces that you do. You say, "Whoa, that's." Right out of 12 tone. I mean, I was listening to one of the things, and I felt like I was almost listening to Mahler, with the textures and the things, and doing it with the big band.
Yeah, he is an exceptional composer for sure. Marvin, as we wind down, and I have to mention, you still look like I was a senior at Eastman when you came up. I'm sure you don't remember me then, but I remember you like it was yesterday. It was beginning of 1983, and I was just getting ready to go on Buddy's band, and you came in as a guest artist, and I remember being so blown away by your presentation and was listening to your every word and taking notes and everything, and it's just been a wonderful experience today to get the chance to talk to you and just hear your thoughts and memories about your extraordinary career. You are 79 years old. You look like you're 61 years old, and I would like to say I would like to look as good as you want to, but it's already too late for me.
I don't think so.
But you're looking great. What's ahead for you? I know you're working more with the quartet, and also My last question is, of all the things you've done in your amazing career, is there anything you would like to do that you haven't done yet?
Well, a couple of things that I would like to have done that I never got a chance to do was, number one, is I'd like to play with Joe Cocker, who's no longer with us, and the other great out of the rock field but marvelous guitarist,
Eric Clapton?
Eric Clapton.
Okay.
I'd love to play with those guys, and I wouldn't mind
Well,
playing.
you still got a shot with Clapton. He's around.
And I love Sting's music too. Very creative, very beautiful. You know, I think that like anyone who still feels a connection to music and to their instrument, I still practice every day. I'm always. You mentioned something about you're being included when guys like me or Randy play and so on. I feel like today I feel very honored that someone like Tony Cadillac would ask me to play on his album. You know, even if it's playing third trumpet or no solos, or just to be in the same room with Tony, because he stands with Bernie and those Ernie Royal and those guys as far as
feel the same way. Yeah, absolutely.
But so I feel very open to that. The one thing that I feel very fortunate about is I don't have to do things that I don't want to do. There's some things that I'm not a fit for. I mean, if you or John Fedchuk or Tony's called up and said, "Hey, I'd like you to do this state and play lead trumpet," I don't do that anymore. I mean, if you're not doing it consistently, why put yourself into a situation that really you want somebody like Tony or John Owen or Kevin Bryan, people like that to come in and play. So I'm fortunate from that thing. As far as what's up, just whatever comes along that's musical. But let's face it, this is a time when there's a lot of young, talented players around. And there are a lot of, I hear guys say, "Hey man, have you heard Marquis Hill?" No, I haven't. He's been around for a while, and you can go along with a bunch of other guys. Probably Mr. Farinacci is one of the few guys that I have had a chance to hear. But I don't spend my time going into the clubs in New York anymore.
Right.
I mean, New York has changed.
Sure.
I'm not. I just. I live an hour away from New York, and to go in and play in the middle of the traffic and deal with all that stuff, to wait for a set, and I find there are times when I'm not very happy with what I hear. Whether that's me or whatever it is. But, it's not like every time that you're going to hear Mintzer play or you're going to hear Eddie Daniels play or Joe Farrell. You were never going, even from the first warm-up tune, you weren't going to say, well, they were just warming up. They were already warm when they got there,
Yeah, absolutely.
But, as far as health and the way I am, since you brought up the subject, we live in a time also when we look around and we see a lot of people that don't look very healthy at all. Any way you look at it, exercise, whatever you do. I've been running for almost 49 years.
I remember you running it in Rochester when you came up to.
I'm still doing it. But it doesn't make any difference, even if you just walk around the block or in the neighborhood or something, to get out and get away from the earphones and the music and the TV and the computer, but go out and do something for yourself and listen to what the world, out there is, and be, be sensible about what you eat and what you drink. I mean, you look at people, I wonder, so many people get out of bed. How do they get out of bed every day? They got to be hurting. I mean, I hurt with old age, but these are people in their 40s, So, I just go out and just want to enjoy my life as much as possible, enjoy my kids, my grandkids, and really have a good time with my wife and friends. And when I do go listen to music, as a matter of fact, I'm going to a concert with the English Orchestra at Carnegie Hall Sunday afternoon. A friend of mine's wife is playing bass in the orchestra, and they're over from England, and they're playing Berlioz. The last time I went to hear them, they were playing Beethoven's Ninth, and it was absolutely thrilling. I love orchestral music.
Yeah.
So There you go.
You still got the passion. That's amazing. Well, Marvin, thank you so much for taking time out and coming and talking about this. This has been a wonderful experience, and
very self-indulgent.
Nah, you shared so many great stories that it's important that they get shared, and we sure appreciate it, and we appreciate the contribution you've made. Our focus is on brass, and what you've given to the brass world is just like your mentors gave. You've given that to all of us. So thanks so much for everything, and
my pleasure.
We will see all of you next time on Bone2Pick.